Marilyn Monroe was convinced she held the ultimate secret, the president's heart. But she was about to learn that in the Kennedy dynasty, love meant nothing and silence meant everything. A terrifying truth delivered to her face by the one woman who understood the extreme price of challenging the White House. She called him the Chief. It was the winter of 1962. The calls came late, always brief, always whispered, always from a hidden line. For Marilyn, those 3 a.m. whispers were proof that she mattered, that she was not just an icon, but a secret shared by the most powerful man in the world. She felt elevated, convinced that the burden of the Oval Office could only be truly lifted by the fragile honesty she represented. She saw their clandestine connection not as an affair, but as a vital, necessary sanctuary for the leader of the free world. In those stolen, dark moments, the weight of her own fame vanished, replaced by the profound significance of being his only confidant. The secrecy itself had become a drug, intoxicating and highly addictive, feeding her need to feel exceptional. She saw past the presidency, past the politics, and into the man she believed needed her to feel truly human. But her need was a blinding light, an illusion that kept her from seeing the reality of the golden cage she had willingly stepped into. The danger wasn't in the indiscretion. The danger was in her belief that this connection was real, deep, and somehow sacred. She had convinced herself that she was the one woman who could understand the burdens of the man leading the free world, the one woman who could make him laugh genuinely without an audience. This conviction was her fatal flaw. She was confusing the intimacy of their private moments with political reality. She believed her vulnerability was her strength. The Kennedys saw it as maximum instability. The diamond earrings and the secretive gifts she received were proof of his affection, she thought, never questioning if they were simply high-value transactions for silence. Her entire emotional economy was based on these whispered tokens of false promises, promises she mistook for a permanent contract, a binding agreement with the most powerful family in the country. She wore the expensive furs and the glittering jewels gifted through discreet channels, believing they were tokens of affection, not merely payments for silence. The reckless match, however, was Marilyn herself. She began making bold, reckless suggestions, talking about her role, dreaming out loud of a future that simply did not exist for her. Her emotional instability, her need for validation, and her open talk of a political promise the president had carelessly made her, a promise of permanence, had finally tripped a silent alarm. This reckless talk placed a massive, impossible target on her own back. Those who loved her saw the change. They saw the frantic energy and the terrifying highs and lows. The problem wasn't the man. It was the structure he represented. The family, the legacy, the overwhelming weight of the nation's highest office. It demanded absolute discretion and absolute control. Marilyn had surrendered neither. The machinery that protected the Kennedy name was already moving, quiet as velvet and effective as steel. The people Marilyn thought she trusted, her aides, her drivers, even certain members of her inner circle, had begun reporting every call, every emotional swing, every reckless word spoken in the presumed safety of her own home. This surveillance was methodical, turning her quiet Los Angeles residence into a pressure cooker of unspoken dread. Every rustle of the garden hedge, every flicker of light became evidence of the invisible net tightening around her. She was being cataloged, analyzed, and categorized not as a woman, but as a potential explosive device, a vulnerability that had to be contained. The air itself seemed to crackle with the hidden presence of men whose careers depended on her immediate silence, men who had been called in from the shadows to clean up the president's mess. She had no idea the net was closing, or that the person who truly understood the cost of this dangerous game was watching from a distance, calculating the least destructive way to eliminate the threat. The net was closing, and the last person she expected was about to make a move that confirmed her life was no longer her own. The woman watching them from the history books was not a victim, but a strategist. She wasn't a jealous wife. She was a political general. And she knew that to save the dynasty, she had to arrange the final meeting with Marilyn before it was too late. She was the one constant, the immovable object against the fleeting celebrity of Marilyn Monroe. Jacqueline was perhaps the only person in Washington who saw Marilyn not as a rival, but as another fragile piece of glass about to be swept up by the machinery of power. Her pain was profound, not because of a broken heart, but because of the deep, weary understanding that the cycle of indiscretion and cleanup was endless. She had long ago traded her personal happiness for her place in history, accepting the role of the dynasty's beautiful, silent guardian, fully aware of the moral compromises required and the price of staying married to a legend. She had married into the idea of Camelot and was determined to defend that idea. Jacqueline viewed the situation with a cold, almost surgical pragmatism. Marilyn was a political hazard, a weakness that adversaries could exploit. In the quiet solitude of her private chambers, Jacqueline was always calculating. She understood the true threat, the private, volatile knowledge Marilyn possessed. A woman in love, feeling betrayed, could become unpredictable. And in the Kennedy world, unpredictability was not tolerated. Jacqueline's focus was utterly fixed on political preservation. Her conversations with trusted aides weren't about jealousy. They were about minimizing political exposure. She studied the reports on Marilyn's emotional state, not with spite, but with the chilling detachment of a battlefield commander assessing collateral risk, noting every documented high and low as a potential liability that her husband's team was preparing to eliminate. She felt a profound cold pity for the starlet caught in a crossfire of her own design. While the president was lost in his illusion, Jacqueline was working the phone lines, coordinating the silent defense. Her strength lay in her silence, her composure, and her deep, tragic knowledge of how far her husband's family would go to secure their standing. She saw the fixers circling, knowing their final solution would be brutal and unforgiving, and felt a profound, chilling responsibility to mitigate the tragedy. She realized that the president's careless affections had placed a target on a woman who was too fragile to protect herself. Her goal was to preempt the brutality with a calculated act of truth. She knew there were forces in the world of American politics far more ruthless than an angry wife. The danger was escalating rapidly. Jacqueline realized that the family apparatus was about to move on Marilyn in a way that would be absolute and possibly irreversible. Jacqueline saw a human being caught in the gears and perhaps a reflection of her own silent captivity. She recognized the vulnerability of a woman trapped by a powerful man, a vulnerability that transcended the First Lady's title and spoke to a shared, profound sorrow. She knew she had to deliver the truth herself before the machine delivered its finality, granting Marilyn one last desperate chance for survival. It was this calculated, tragic compassion that spurred her final, desperate action. She knew that if the Attorney General's people moved, there would be no warning, only swift, devastating finality. She decided to intervene, not to threaten, but to save her legacy. The call was placed through a trusted, discreet channel. The message was simple, stark, and delivered with chilling formality. The message was that Mistress Kennedy needed to meet with Marilyn Monroe. It was a royal summons. The silent guardian had broken her silence. The call came from an unmarked number, and the voice on the other end was too smooth, too polite, and spoke a name that made Marilyn's blood run cold. Mistress Kennedy would like a private word. Marilyn stood in her sunny sitting room, the telephone receiver heavy in her trembling hand. The sound of that request felt heavier than any threat because it confirmed the end of her beautiful fantasy. Her glamour, her fame, her whole life suddenly felt flimsy against the weight of the Kennedy name, the weight of history itself. She felt a sudden, terrible nausea, the realization that her secret was universally known. It wasn't a threat, it was worse. It was an acknowledgement. That one quiet sentence, Mistress Kennedy would like a private word, shattered the illusion. Marilyn had expected fury, but this silent, regal summons was utterly unexpected, chilling her to the bone. The messenger gave minimal details. A secluded home in Santa Monica Canyon tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the evening. The formality was terrifying, suggesting a royal decree. The venue itself, a neutral, anonymous location with no visible security, implied the meeting was strictly business, a judgment devoid of personal passion or public oversight. There would be no witnesses to the First Lady's human frailty, only a clean, silent exchange of power. Marilyn's immediate reaction was a whirlwind of competing emotions. Part of her wanted to refuse, but a wiser part knew this was a command she could not ignore. Refusing would turn a negotiation into open warfare. Her curiosity, however, was a powerful, reckless driver. She convinced herself that this was her chance to finally prove the validity of her connection, woman to woman, and emerge victorious. That the president's true feelings would somehow be her ultimate defense, allowing her to appeal to Jacqueline's own sense of romantic justice. Her internal debate centered on the single, most intimate promise the president had made her, a carelessly whispered plan for a future life together, which Marilyn held onto as her ultimate shield of truth. She rehearsed her words, intending to wield this promise like a sword, ready to argue that she deserved her happiness, even at the cost of the First Lady's. This delusion gave her the courage to agree. But as the appointed time approached, the glamour of the dramatic confrontation evaporated, leaving only raw fear. She drove herself in her own car, alone. The drive felt like a descent into cold reality, the setting sun mirroring the death of her illusions. The house was exactly as described, understated, surrounded by towering protective hedges, and utterly silent. The isolation was heavier than any security detail. She checked her simple attire. Taking a final, shaky breath, Marilyn reached out and pushed the heavy wooden door open, stepping across the threshold and into the impossibly quiet home. She was entering the lioness's den. The air inside was cool and filtered, devoid of the smog and noise of the world that used her, a calculated atmosphere of calm before the storm. The room was not opulent, but impossibly quiet. The furnishings were spare and classically elegant, lending the space an air of sterile judgment. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, creating a false sense of peace in this chamber of political reckoning. The only sound was the faint hum of central air conditioning, a sound of perfect sterile control, a sound that masked the rapid beat of Marilyn's heart. Marilyn stepped inside and saw her. Jacqueline Kennedy was standing by a window, bathed in the soft fading light, her composure utterly perfect. There was no shouting, no accusations, no drama. Jacqueline offered a small, sad smile, a look that conveyed profound understanding. "Thank you for coming, Miss Monroe," she said. Marilyn, who had prepared a speech full of passion, felt all her words evaporate. Jacqueline merely gestured to a pair of chairs. The conversation began indirectly. Jacqueline spoke of the immense, crushing weight of public expectation. "Tell me, Miss Monroe," Jacqueline asked, her eyes coolly assessing, "did you manage to secure a decent night's sleep last night, or did the reporters outside your gate keep you up late again? We have the same problem, you see. We are both products on a global shelf, valued for our packaging, never our contents." This instantly disarmed Marilyn's celebrity armor. Jacqueline spoke of the loneliness of inhabiting a role the world created for you. "We are both reflections, Miss Monroe, polished to perfection, but utterly empty inside when the cameras turn away. This is the truth of being a female icon in this country. The world demands we be beautiful, but never real." "The White House," Jacqueline said, her voice changing to a low, formal register, "is not a home, Miss Monroe. It is a stage, a symbol, and the people who run it, the ones you never see, the men who truly hold the power, they will protect that symbol at any cost." Her gaze finally turned back to Marilyn. "They see the president not as a man, but as a vessel of history. Any vulnerability, any perceived weakness, it is systematically removed. Your emotional honesty, Marilyn, is their greatest weakness and their greatest threat. Your capacity to tell the truth is your biggest error." Marilyn tried to interject to defend her connection, but Jacqueline gently cut her off. "Please, don't speak of my husband. This is not about fidelity, Miss Monroe. It is about control. The Kennedy name is an institution. You are completely uncontrollable, and that, in their eyes, is a massive danger." Jacqueline's refusal to acknowledge the president as anything other than a political vessel was devastating. Marilyn understood. Jacqueline wasn't angry. She was concerned about a threat to the Constitution. Jacqueline's eyes held no malice, only cold, terrifying knowledge. The First Lady leaned forward, her composure never wavering. "What I am trying to explain to you," Jacqueline said, her voice dropping, "is that the people around him are preparing to act. And once they start, even the president cannot stop them." The air grew heavy, chilling Marilyn with the sudden realization that the danger was not if the hammer would drop, but when it would strike. She realized that the power Jacqueline possessed was not rooted in love or marriage, but in her terrifying understanding of the rules of the game. Jacqueline didn't speak of a husband or a lover. She spoke of a lineage, a dynasty, and the cold, unfeeling apparatus of power. The contrast between Jacqueline's composed warning and Marilyn's visible fear created a moment of terrifying cinematic stillness, a chasm between innocence and bitter experience. "You see a man, Miss Monroe," Jacqueline whispered. "I see the head of a machine, and that machine is programmed for one purpose, survival. You possess a sincerity that frightens them." She stressed that the architects of the family's image, the fixers, would view Marilyn's emotional vulnerability as an acute threat. They would not see her as a woman, but as a variable that needed to be zeroed out. The emotional manipulation must climax here. Do you understand what fixers truly means, Miss Monroe? Jacqueline's voice was suddenly colder than ice. They are not part of the government. They are the silent, professional hands who make problems, like you, vanish without leaving a trace. Their methods are absolute and leave no paper trail. They are the family's ultimate defense, activated when image protection becomes survival. They have already drawn up your exit plan, and they are waiting for the signal. Once they receive their final order, they will not see your beauty or your pain. They will only see the capital offense you have the power to cause to the legacy. The key emotional beat arrived when Jacqueline confessed her own powerlessness. Do you think I chose this silence? She asked, a flash of genuine, profound anguish crossing her composed face. I am the First Lady, and yet when this machine moves, I can only watch. I'm trying to tell you this because once they begin to move, there is no appeal, no negotiation, no mercy. I can't stop them. No one can. This admission was devastating to Marilyn. It repositioned Jacqueline as a fellow prisoner. The warning was not coming from strength, but from weary, informed resignation. Jacqueline then spoke about what Marilyn knew. You have the capacity to cause great misfortune to the family's legacy, Jacqueline said, and in this world, that is a capital offense. They view you as a bomb with a faulty timer, Miss Monroe, and they are already moving to defuse you. She confirmed that security measures around Marilyn had already been activated. The protection of the Kennedy name demanded that she disappear quietly. Jacqueline had delivered the full scale of the danger. Then, Jacqueline leaned in close, her composure finally cracking, and she whispered the terrifying warning that changed everything. 12 words that were not a threat, but a prophecy of destruction. The light had faded entirely. Marilyn braced herself. The words Jacqueline spoke were far colder than anger. The only way out of this family's life, she murmured, is to disappear entirely, Marilyn, and they have ways of making that happen quietly. The sentence hung in the air, weighted with absolute finality. This wasn't about love. It was about political erasure. Marilyn felt the reality of the danger settle over her. She was expendable, and her celebrity was not a shield. The terror was realizing that her life was now collateral damage in a political game where the rules were written by men who valued legacy above all else. Her fame, which had always been her armor, was now her greatest vulnerability. Jacqueline offered the cold, impossible path of escape. You must stop all contact. You must leave Hollywood. Change your name. If you embrace silence, the family will ensure you are protected. This was the ultimatum. Marilyn felt a wave of icy terror followed by a fierce resurgence of defiance. She realized that to accept this deal was to become Jacqueline, sacrificing her spirit and her truth for survival. I can't be silent, Marilyn cried, her voice breaking. To become silent is to cease existing, and I won't let your family take that from me. I won't lose my soul just to keep my life. I would rather be ruined and truthful than safe and empty. I won't spend the rest of my days looking over my shoulder for your fixers, waiting for the final quiet curtain. Jacqueline's face remained composed, but her eyes closed briefly in tragic failure. Then you leave me no choice but to let you go, Jacqueline said. You are prioritizing your emotional truth over your physical safety, Miss Monroe. You are choosing a dramatic end over a quiet beginning. I sincerely hope you survive your own conviction. I truly do. But know that the alternative is not a reconciliation with my husband, but a confrontation with the history he represents. Marilyn turned and walked out. She drove away from the silent home, but the truth sat beside her like a ghost. She had chosen to ignore the one person who understood the danger. The terrible, silent countdown had already begun. She drove away from the silent house, but she wasn't alone. The terrifying knowledge that she was now a ticking clock sat beside her. The glamour of Hollywood meant nothing now. The bright lights of the city felt menacing, no longer welcoming. The paranoia began immediately. Every car that followed her, every quiet voice on the phone felt like surveillance. She found herself checking under her furniture, watching the windows for signs of movement, constantly searching for the invisible hands Jackie had described, unable to eat or sleep because the silence had become louder than any noise. The fear was physical pressure. Her desperation led her to the president. She immediately began dialing his known private numbers, but the doors were silently, effectively sealed. "The president is indisposed," they'd say, or "he is tied up in important diplomatic matters." The truth was clearer than the lies. He was shielded from her. The shift from "I can't reach him" to "he doesn't want to be reached" was the ultimate devastating betrayal that fueled her final desperate act. The total cessation of contact was more painful than any public breakup. Marilyn was already being erased. This rejection drove her into a terrible spiral of profound sadness. She realized her love had been an operational liability, and the president was choosing the smooth functioning of his machine over her well-being. This was the moment the dream died, leaving only fear in its place, a fear of absolute abandonment, knowing she had been sacrificed for the sake of a political image. In a frantic attempt to protect herself, Marilyn made a specific, desperate decision. She needed to anchor her truth somewhere secure. She spent an hour writing down a key piece of information, a detail that, if revealed, would confirm the danger. She then hid it, a final fragile act of defiance against the silence. She meticulously chose a hiding place that was too mundane for a political sweep, but too meaningful for a loyal friend to overlook. She felt a profound peace in committing this single rebellious act, signing her truth into the invisible archives of history. She sealed the paper, a precious token of her truth, and placed it within a small volume. It was her insurance policy, a silent scream of reality. She had run out of time and now stood alone. Marilyn realized the warning had been her execution date. The silent walls closed in. Her frantic efforts to reach the president were met only with silence. Her outward behavior became erratic, interpreted as instability, but her emotional swings were the terrified reactions of a woman who knew she was being hunted. The fear was a constant, gnawing presence. Every time the phone rang, she waited for the voice of the man who had promised her everything, only to be met by the cold formality of a secretary. She understood that the fixers were not just cutting communication, they were intentionally starving her of the validation she needed to survive, hoping she would disappear under the weight of her own distress. She spent hours on the telephone, but the president, now fully enclosed by the protective layers of his family, was unavailable. The machinery was efficient. He was shielded from the drama. She attempted one final public act of communication, a plea to a trusted friend to be relayed back to the president. But even this failed. The message was intercepted and quietly neutralized. The family's fixers were already ensuring that every erratic outburst was dismissed as proof of her fragility. She was being systematically isolated. The world was receiving the carefully crafted narrative that Marilyn was emotionally unraveling, preparing the stage for her final dismissal and minimizing the credibility of anything she might say. The glamour became a flimsy shield. In the quiet of her home, she felt the walls closing in. The realization sunk in. The powerful people Jacqueline had warned her about were not going to let her quietly disappear. She had lost. The final night approached. The weight of loneliness and betrayal was now heavier than any political secret. In her final moments, with the full weight of Jacqueline's prophecy upon her, Marilyn made one last secret choice, a desperate, defiant act meant to echo Jacqueline's warning across history. The night was hot and heavy, a silence settling over the house. The atmosphere was less like a quiet home and more like a carefully controlled stage set for a final tragic scene. The wind outside seemed to whisper the name of the family that held all the cards, a chilling final lullaby signaling the end of her freedom. She knew the machine was outside her door. She felt utterly alone. The final hours were not a surrender to despair, but a frantic race against impending doom. She understood that her life was being taken from her by a chilling orchestration of abandonment. Marilyn moved through her house. She knew that the machine was now moving toward its final, irreversible solution. She remembered Jacqueline's clear warning. They have ways of making that happen quietly. She went to the volume, retrieved the sealed paper. This was her last weapon. She realized she couldn't risk leaving it for the cleanup crews to find. It needed a witness. She decided to trust one former confidant. She made a final cryptic note, a desperate message giving the man the exact location of the hidden note. This was a forwarding address for the truth. She sealed this final message, handling it with the solemnity of a final will, knowing it was the last thing she could control, the last words she would ever speak against the silence. As the chilling sequence of events unfolded, Marilyn's only focus was that cryptic message. She managed to hide the message where the loyal housekeeper would find it. It was a final refusal to be erased entirely. The single sealed truth was now known only as the coded key, a symbolic heart of her rebellion. The lights went out. The silence returned, but this time it was absolute. The official reports would spin the narrative, but the truth lay in the terrible fulfillment of Jacqueline Kennedy's warning. The political machine had demanded silence. The machine had won the immediate battle for silence, but the fight for Marilyn's legacy was just beginning. The final act of defiance, the tiny hidden note, was left behind, waiting for the right person to find it and confirm the terrible price she had paid. The official reports told one story, but the truth lay in the silence. The world mourned the glamorous star, never knowing the true, cold reason for her final isolation. They assumed a weakness of spirit. They missed the strength of her final, secret stand against the most powerful forces in the country, a stand for her own dignity and her right to her own narrative. Yet Marilyn's final, defiant whisper did not vanish. The loyal housekeeper found the cryptic message. It led the former confidant back to Marilyn's famous bookshelf and the single verifiable fact the political family had desperately tried to bury. He understood immediately that this was a document of history, a profound truth that needed to be protected forever. He ensured it was placed in an anonymous, secure archive, guaranteeing that the truth survived the silence. The coded key became the shadow evidence that kept the full, cold reality of the machine's power alive, a whispered challenge across the years. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the silence around the First Lady was profound. Jacqueline never spoke of that meeting. She carried the secret of the terrible confrontation. She bore the silent grief and the lifelong burden of keeping the family secrets sealed. The First Lady, who had warned of the dynasty's power, was now eternally bound to its greatest scandal, a witness to a human tragedy she could not stop. Her sacrifice of personal voice was tragically mirrored by Marilyn's final sacrifice, confirming that in their world, women were either silenced or erased. This knowledge became her own silent penance. The truth of that fateful meeting was not about jealousy. It was about the collision of two women with two completely opposing forces. Marilyn was the force of emotional truth. Jacqueline was the force of cold, powerful control. Both were victims of a system that demanded silence and obedience. It was a moment of tragic solidarity, a final act where the First Lady and the starlet recognized each other as fellow prisoners of the same powerful men. Their shared knowledge was the ultimate enduring bond, forged in the terror of the dynasty's shadow, a truth whispered only to the cameras of history. The final lesson is one of dignity. Marilyn Monroe, in her final moments, was not just a symbol of tragedy, but a symbol of defiance. She refused to let her story be rewritten by the men who abandoned her. She risked everything to preserve one fragment of truth. Her departure forced the Kennedy machine to realize the true, devastating cost of their control. Her legacy isn't the sadness. It is her final, desperate choice to ensure that her truth, the truth of the First Lady's warning, and the truth of her own vulnerability would ultimately matter more than the official silence. She reminded us that the fight for our own truth is the hardest fight of all. And sometimes, the most important people aren't the ones who win, they are the ones who refuse to be forgotten. The final battle Marilyn fought was not for a man, but for her own truth. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that the greatest battles are often silent, like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories where the glamour always meets the ghost.